Alright. Hello, welcome to IMMVR, Interactive Music Videos in VR discussion group. I have here today Cecilia Cook. This presentation specifically is going to be about audio reactive models and how people have approached basically visuals that are directly affected by audio. So they've kind of been doing 2D things for like live performances for a bit. So there's actually a few tools out there to have that occur. I looked up. There's like Resolume. There's VDMX. There's a couple of them, but a lot of course, it's kind of like a new area because there's some really interesting things that you can do. There's like processing power that's available now that you can use. The basic, the most important thing is it uses frequency content. The vast majority of these use frequency content that you can kind of decide, like high frequency, low frequency. You can decide a band where it measures how loud it is, and it uses that, turns that into like a single number, like continuous single number, and then that affects a parameter, a visual parameter. So, so what that means is basically you can have like a kick, you define the frequency band, and every time the kick plays, it bumps the number, and various. So it bumps the number to like a certain amount depending on how loud it is in low frequency information, and turns that into a number like, for instance, distortion or glitch effect or color. And in doing that, it affects a specific part, and then you can attach a separate kind of frequency band to this, like snare frequencies or high frequencies, or because this is designed for live performance, that's kind of usually where the most things are. You can of course like have different, like really high like hi-hats or whatever, just general like mid to high energy, like every time like if the music is really good, like, but high energy, you can just have it just like depending on the loudness of just the entire track, have specific parameters going. So that's this works especially for live performances, and because we're doing interactive music videos, I feel like it's an important kind of thing to think about, especially since we're intending to have the users change the music. If we want to give them that little extra bit of freedom that we don't really plan every arrangement together, like if they're given the option to somehow mix, or given the option to really choose instruments in more subtle ways. I know I've been given the advice that for the most part you're going to want to make the changes really big and simple, but in some cases I feel like that's not always going to be the case, and I think it would be really interesting to have an engine that interprets the sound that's going through your computer so that it can have an element of the environment that does still react to that. Even if it's not a big change, you can still, like if you move the snare over like a bit, or if you change the groove a small amount, you can see that visually. And I'm going to go over a little bit over the pipeline that I kind of noticed. I watched a couple of tutorial videos on like really basic stuff. I have not done this myself, but like the tutorial videos and how they introduce you to the thing is kind of pretty telling. So essentially this is 2D, by the way. We're still in 2D. This is not 3D stuff. Okay. So you start usually with a looping video. There's some really weird loops out there. There's a community that makes these interesting loops. They don't always have to have it doesn't always have to be super continuous. Sometimes they even have like jerks as part of it. As long as it's like a loop of some kind. Some of the more interesting ones that I liked personally, this is a personal thing, I like the ones that have like fast and then slow, or like beats of movement that you can kind of like perhaps time to a tempo, which you kind of can do. You can affect the speed at which the loop goes. Based on one parameter, that's a parameter that you can alter based on frequency information. So you can have it jerk every time something hits, which is cool. It's cool. It's really interesting. This is all 2D still, but it's an interesting way to think about how you would transport it to 3D assets, which I'm gonna basically start just say here they haven't done yet. They don't really have as much about that, but I'm going to cover what they do have in 3D in VR shortly. But after you've picked your looping video, you choose. I mean, you define your frequency bands like I described, like kick, snare, other stuff, instruments that you like specifically care about for this track or whatever that you can actually predict the frequency information for. Beyond that, it gets kind of complicated. If you want to try and separate an instrument exactly without using frequency content, that's like difficult. That takes some effort and that takes some like pre-planning. It's not as good for live performances, so there hasn't been as much work done in terms of. But I'm sure you could if you individually separated all your instruments into tracks and then attached audio-visual, like and then attached a parameter to that. That could be a technique. I'm not entirely sure how you would go about doing that, but it's something to keep in mind. Anyway, so you define these frequency kind of bands, and then you attach them to various visual effects. Now I'm going to have a couple of examples of visual effects. I mentioned some of them earlier, but it can affect color. It can go around like the RGB scale, or it can just kind of like flash green and go back to red or whatever. You can also like affect opacity, which is basically how see-through a thing is.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Opacity? I think so. I don't think it's opacity. Right? No, that sounds a little wrong. I think it's opacity.
Opacity. That's
opacity?
It's fine. It doesn't
Whatever. All right,
I
so
was just
opacity, the transparency of an object, to some extent, I saw this really cool one, which is like, basically you have these ghost speakers that only appear like at like really high energy moments, and they're kind of floating around, but like they're you can't see them, and then they kind of ghost in to like specific parts of the music, and you can do that like with a lot of things, not just like speakers. There's layers in the program usually that you're encouraged to use layers. That's kind of like one of the biggest like sources of creativity. Is you layer different either loops on top of each other, or like not necessarily, like some loops have the background already in them, some of them don't. Some of them are just to put on top of other backgrounds, and then you affect, you can develop those layers almost individually from the loop and have totally separate parameters attached to that, and then have it fade in, or you can switch between two completely separate ones, like based on a parameter. It's like when this is quiet, it goes to like version A, and then when it's loud, it goes to version B. And then when it's kind of in the middle, it kind of like goes back and forth a little bit based on how, like, and you can get some really interesting effects that way, especially if like they're really different. And you're like, oh wow, there's totally separate things happening based on this section of music versus that section of the music.
So it could totally be like a sort of like if you're in
section
A, section B,
visually.
And then you go like you're sort of into section A, and you have like 3/4 of the section A music playing, but then you have a quarter of
a bit. Well, and you can change the opacity. There's actually, in the program that I saw in Resolume, there's different transitions between layers. So it doesn't just have to be like opacity, like transparency. It can also be like location in a transition, like a sweep, or like a weird fuzzy thing. You can actually like, there's some really interesting things that they've attached to this. And again, this is all in 2D, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be. I feel we're not that far away from people making some really interesting audio reactive visuals for VR, so we just have to kind of get VR music scene going, which the Wave VR is doing. So we'll hope that ball gets rolling and get some really interesting plugins for visual, like just trippy ass. Okay.